considering the topic of today. Good evening. It is my distinct honor and privilege today to introduce Laura. I know Laura here as one of the most talented, diligent, hardworking students, and there's like 1,500 more adjectives I can say about her. All of them fantastic. I had the opportunity to work with. She is a psychology major with a minor in criminal justice and in writing. So you can say she always finds the right words. Her future goal is to become a therapist to help others navigate their own marriages. But today, she's here to examine the narratives that keep us all at night. Please welcome Laura for her presentation, How the Mind Differentiates Fictional Horror from Horrific Reality.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming here. Thank you, Dr. L, for introducing me to this presentation. So, as he already said, this presentation is on how the mind differentiates between fictional horror and horrific reality. And to begin, I just have a short outline here of what I will cover in this presentation, beginning with a little bit of background and introduction and what inspired me to create this presentation in the first place. I will also provide an introduction to trauma and understanding trauma and stress-related disorders, and also research that's specifically related to this topic. Then I will go over the present study, and I will also cover those results and findings, and then I will go into the discussion and interpretation and the conclusion. So, to begin with background and introduction, the inspiration for this study came from my own personal experience after reading a very disturbing horror novel that was within the splatterpunk genre, which is much more disturbing and intense and violent than most horror genres that you might find commonly being sold or just in the library. And it stuck in my mind for a very long time. So when I was thinking about what projects I might want to do, I decided that I was very interested in discovering whether or not reading horror fiction adversely affects the mind. As anybody who has read horror before knows, horror often pushes psychological limits, whether you're watching it or whether you're reading it. And some people refuse to engage entirely because it is too much for them, it's too upsetting to them, and it's not something that they want to engage with. And going off of that, fiction, just because something is fiction, does not mean that the emotional impact is negated. So something can be fictional, and it can still have a deep effect on a person. Because of the dark topics that it explores, it is a type of fiction that explores the darker parts of the human experience that we often don't get the chance to engage with otherwise. But it also can serve as a way to engage with more traumatic themes from a distance, from a safe distance. So then, following that, the question that I also want to examine is if horror fiction adversely affects the mind, how do we proceed? And then also, if it doesn't, what do we do with that? So now I will get into the introduction to trauma and related research and some different disorders that can go along with that. First, in understanding trauma and stress-related disorders, I have listed a few different disorders above, those being most commonly post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which involves more chronic or long-term traumatic experiences than PTSD does, and also acute stress disorder, which has similar symptoms to PTSD, but is also usually more short-lived and occurs sooner after the traumatic event. Something important to note about any type of trauma is that there is a great interpersonal variation in symptoms, and they can greatly impact both the mind and the body, so it doesn't just impact your thoughts and your feelings, it can impact you physically and make you more susceptible to illnesses and other diseases. And it can also be comorbid with other disorders, and I'll get into that a little bit after this, talking about some of the common disorders that trauma-related disorders can be comorbid with. So some important diagnostic criteria that's important for this study is that PTSD or other trauma-related disorders require the experience or witnessing of a traumatic real-life event. The real-life part is very important for the topic that I'm covering because it has to be something that is real, whether that is experienced firsthand or whether that's experienced secondhand, like if you are an EMT and you witness somebody pass away while you're on the job. Some symptoms include flashbacks, moments of intense dissociation, nightmares, inexplicable fear or anxiety, mood changes, and general aversion to being reminded of those stressors. And these are just some of the symptoms. There are other symptoms that exist, but these are some of the more primary ones that typically appear in these disorders. Now, going into the influence of trauma on depression, trauma and traumatic experiences can heavily influence the presence and symptoms of depression. Typically, they can create more intense symptoms, so the symptoms that you do have, if you have depression, along with this, will be more intense. And it can create a longer trajectory of depression as well. Specifically, one study by Watts et al. In 2020 found that childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences have been shown to change the experience of depression in college students. That was what this study was specifically looking at, and these students showed longer periods of depression, and they were also less responsive to psychotropic medication, which is basically medication that directly affects mood, thinking, and behavior. It can also influence things like anxiety and other areas of life. The study done by Yelch et al. In 2024 showed that there was an increased risk of substance use when somebody had experienced something traumatic, and within that, alcohol was implicated the most. The study also examined some other drug usage, cannabis usage, but those things were not implicated as much as alcohol use was in relation to depression and anxiety. There's also an increased risk of anxiety when it comes to having traumatic experiences, and the same study that looked at depression in college students also looked at anxiety in college students and found similarly that the experience was changed for those students, and they had a more heightened stress response specifically during stressful situations. Another thing that the same study found was that there is often a co-occurrence with physiological conditions alongside of mental health conditions. So when somebody has experienced a lot of trauma in their childhood or at any other point in life, they have a higher risk for autoimmune diseases and other like neuroimmune diseases, along with mental illness. So another study that relates to the topic that I have today involved a case study of a young girl with PTSD-like syndrome in response to a horror movie. And this movie that she watched was when she was 6 years old, and it was actually Scary Movie 3, which if you've watched any of the scary movies, you know that they're not actually that scary. However, and this little girl recognized the fact that they weren't that scary when she watched them, and she knew it wasn't real, and she understood that. However, she began to still experience some very disturbing symptoms related to watching that movie. She began having trouble sleeping when she went to bed at night. She had significant distress when anything reminded her of the movie. She had nightmares about the movie and just nightmares in general. And she also was experiencing inexplicable sadness at night, which if you remember I mentioned before, one aspect of PTSD is that there can be mood changes. And so she experienced multiple symptoms that went along with a PTSD diagnosis, but she couldn't actually be diagnosed with PTSD because the experience that caused all of those symptoms was a fictional experience rather than something she experienced in real life. but she still continued to experience these symptoms for 10 years following the watching of the movie, and only after getting therapy that would typically be administered to people with trauma or stress-related disorders did she start to improve. The same study also found evidence to suggest that there were other cases with people who had similar experience. They did a meta-analysis and found 13 other cases where children or teenagers experienced a PTSD-like syndrome in response to watching horror movies, which then brings up the question if there is an implication for secondary trauma or something similar to that related to fiction. And another thing that I looked at was secondary trauma through media. So media was an acceptable thing for people to experience, but usually it had to be related to a person's job. If they witnessed something through the media that was related to their job or something very personal to them. But one study in 2024 examined specifically doom scrolling, which I think most of you know what doom scrolling is and probably have engaged in it yourselves before. But doom scrolling specifically did not start being used as a term until after the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was used to specifically refer to continuous scrolling through negative or distressing content on social media. So not just simply scrolling for hours on end, but specifically looking at very negative content. And what this study found was that doom scrolling indicates higher presence of depression and anxiety symptoms in the participants that they examined. And those symptoms that they exhibited were very similar to secondary trauma, despite the experiences not actually being personal or witnessed experiences. But on the contrary, there are some studies that show evidence that horror fiction can actually have positive effects and create more resilience in people. So one study in 2021 found that reading horror fiction and apocalyptic fiction actually prepared individuals better to handle the COVID-19 pandemic. Those individuals who read horror, even were just morbidly curious, so had the desire to read horror or even look into these topics, had greater mental resilience and less psychological distress when the COVID-19 pandemic was occurring. So now, with all of that in mind, I would go into the present study, which examines where we go from here. So, as I talked about a little bit before, there's little research on how reading horror fiction specifically affects the mind. There's been some research on horror movies and case studies with people looking at horror movies and experiencing PTSD-like syndrome, but there's very little on what just reading actually does. So more research then needs to be done on the impact of horror fiction to understand the mind's resilience and how the mind actually does differentiate between fiction and reality. So this current study, the goal was to examine participants' reactions and mental health before and after reading certain horror fiction selections, and I'll talk about those a little bit more as well. And my hypothesis going off of this was that participants will experience a decline in mental health similar to experiencing or witnessing a real-life traumatic event following the readings of horror fiction. And what I intend with this is to be a sort of conceptual replication of the case study that I discussed, where participants would experience similar symptoms to what the little girl did after watching a horror movie. So to begin with, some of my materials involved 3 mental health tests that I administered to participants. The Patient Health Questionnaire 9, or the PHQ-9, specifically looked at participants' depression levels and also their general well-being, and I gave this to them in a survey both before and after reading the horror fiction selections. I also gave them the Generalized Anxiety Disorder 7, or the GAD-7 both before and after they read the stories. And then finally, in the last survey that I sent out to participants, I gave them the PTSD checklist for the DSM-5 or the PCL-5 to test for specific trauma-related symptoms in response to the horror fiction. And I did that afterwards because the questions specifically relate to the experiencing or witnessing of an event, and so I wanted them to relate the stories that they had read to that. Some of my other materials involved horror fiction short stories that I selected with a variety of topics in mind involving the supernatural, grief, death, violence, and gore, and each of them had varying degrees of horror intensity. So some were lighter, slightly more classic ghost story related, and some were heavier or involved more personal, intense horror. And that image right there is one that I actually took from one of the stories. They were all taken from either magazines that were free to read online or were already public use, and I have the list of the stories if any of you want to know which ones I specifically used afterwards. So going into the results and findings after this study, another important thing that I forgot to mention was that participants read these short horror stories over 2 weeks. So they had 10 in total that they were meant to read, and they had the Monday through Friday to read them with the weekends off in case they needed to catch up with them or just wanted to spend a few days not reading horror. So in looking at the depression and anxiety symptoms, what I actually found at the end of this study was that there wasn't actually a significant amount of change before and after reading the horror stories like I expected. The symptoms in response were not as significant. There wasn't as much significant change downwardly. As you can see, for the anxiety and depression, I have some of the statistics listed down there. If you understand what that means, great, but I'm not going to spend too much time getting into that. Just know that the specific results were not significant for either of those, which means that my hypothesis in this area does not actually have evidence to support it. And as you can see, I included some of the graphs for anxiety and depression, and for both of them, a surprising thing that you might know when looking at it is that there's an actual slight decrease in both the anxiety and depression sections, and when I tested it on the opposite end of my hypothesis, there still wasn't that significant of a change. However, if I had a larger sample size for future research, might show that the change could be more significant. So that's an area that I would love to examine further, because this actually shows a little bit of the opposite of what I was expecting. And as you can see, for the PTSD symptoms, it was very similar. The graph that I included in there shows that there's very scattered symptoms. So some people did experience very strong responses to the short horror fiction stories, because there are a couple up there who have very high levels after testing. But overall, the sample mean that I had, so the average of each of the participants, was not similar to the mean that I expected it to be. There was actually a significant amount of variation, as the graph shows, which is what the z-test that says significant underneath it was testing for. But overall, they were primarily lower than the expected average. And along with those things, I also examined open-ended feelings and reactions, because I wanted to see, even though scales like Likert tests and everything can see a lot, I think it's important to see what people actually report when they're talking about these things, so that they can explain how they're feeling more than just on a scale level basis. So leading up to the reading, participants mostly reported positive feelings, so feelings of excitement, anticipation, curiosity, but some anxiety and nervousness. Not too much, but there was some still listed in there. During the reading, the emotions that were reported were primarily negative. There were some positive in there, like curiosity, excitement, and satisfaction, but most of the people reported fear, nervousness, discomfort, hurt, and overwhelm, and other emotions related to those words listed there. And then following the reading, most reported positive feelings. So excitement, intent, satisfaction, or anticipation, which was also very interesting to me and seemed to reflect the results of the mental health tests afterwards. But some did also report anxiety, lingering fear, or nervousness following the readings. So with all of this, you're probably wondering, well, if this is not significant, then why am I sitting here listening to this? Did you really spend an entire semester working on this? Just to find out that everything was insignificant? And in a way, the answer is yes, I did. But just because they are statistically insignificant results does not mean that they actually mean nothing. So the results still can have discussion and interpretation, and with this, I am finding out more that if I change my hypothesis to perhaps look at what benefits horror fiction has, there might be more to find in that area. So going into it first, I wanted to look at the possibility of differences in horror intensity. So something important to note is that real life trauma goes beyond what the mind and body can handle. So because of how intense real life traumatic experiences are, the most common horror fiction might just not be horrifying enough to actually fit what real life experiences can do to a person. But other horror fiction might create similar results. If you remember what I talked about my own personal experiences with reading something that was perhaps too disturbing for my own mind to handle. So horror fiction that relates more to personal experiences or is more intense, such as the splatterpunk genre that I mentioned before, might actually have more of an impact than some of the stories that I selected, because as much as I did want to see interesting results, I also didn't want to actually harm any of my participants, and that gets a little strange with the ethics there. So I had to be careful with what stories I selected. Another thing that I would like to look at further is the difference between visual and auditory stimuli versus imagined stimuli. So when you're reading fiction, you're imagining all the scenes in your mind. Even though it's written out, you have to create those scenes with your own imagination. And visual stimuli and auditory stimuli might create stronger responses because it relates more to how we actually experience the world on a daily basis. And so, even though the imagination is powerful, it might not be powerful enough, especially because when we are reading horror fiction, our minds are able to recognize the fact that it is not real, and that it is the one creating the images in our minds. And also, another thing is that most research up to this point has focused on visual and auditory stimuli, such as movies, videos, and images. So perhaps further research into reading horror fiction might yield slightly different results. Most importantly, though, this has significant implications for mental resilience, because the participants did not have significant adverse response to the horror fiction they read. It is likely that the brain is in fact very resilient against fiction, and even when horror causes fear or anxiety, as some of the participants reported in the open-ended responses, the mind still seems to recognize reality, because even though they responded with those feelings, their mental health did not actually decline. Their depression and anxiety responses did not actually go up afterwards and actually decrease. And so horror fiction in general might actually cause greater resilience, because, like I said before, it allows a safe place to explore traumatic material without having to engage with real-life content that could actually be traumatic. And as I showed you with the graphs, there were slightly lower depression and anxiety scores afterwards. And the past COVID-19 research that I discussed before showed that participants who read horror more often or apocalyptic literature or anything in that vein had high levels of mental resilience. But something important to note is that greater anxiety or existing trauma may be indicative of whether or not horror has adverse effects. So if there is horror fiction that relates strongly to personal experiences, or you're a person who does not read horror at all, and so you're not used to the topics covered in horror fiction, it might have a greater impact. Something to mention with this study is, well, I had a random selection of participants. Most of the people who participated in this study probably already read horror because they might not want to participate in the study if they didn't like reading horror. And even though that's more of an assumption on my part, it's still something to be considered. So the general application, as I've stated a couple times, horror fiction may be an avenue for building greater resilience to real life adversity, just overall. Instead of creating adverse effects, it might be something that can actually help people improve. And it is evidently based on the evidence that my own research provided and some of the other research that other studies provided, a healthy way to examine topics like grief, death, and the afterlife and violence without engaging with disturbing real-life content. So it comes at very little cost because if your mind recognizes the fact that it's fictional, it's able to hold up that barrier against it without there being actual consequences to engaging with it. And another thing is that it could be a way for psychologists and others to understand traumatizing experiences, because something about horror fiction is that it does not just explore the dark things that people might experience, and it doesn't just explore the traumatic experiences themselves, but it also explores people's reactions to those experiences. And people put things that they have witnessed in real life or things that they themselves have experienced into the fiction that they write, even if that fiction does not necessarily reflect actual real life entirely. There's still some reflection of the things that people actually feel and how they react to traumatic material. So in conclusion, horror fiction may not have a significant adverse impact, but instead it may influence more positive mental health results. And overall, more research with a larger scope still needs to be done, more participants, just bigger in general with people reading different horror fiction, and also more studies with possibly more mental health tests in that direction being